Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal, and today we're going to bring you one of the most interesting subjects, I hope, of our current time. We're going to do a 4-part series on China, and I'm joined by my panelist, Arif Ahmad. Arif, Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
And I'm also joined by Yusuf Aftab, our new panelist. So welcome, Yusuf, to the Living History team.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal and Arif.
Before we sort of start getting to the program, I need to set the scene and explain why we're doing this program and why China is so important. Everyone agrees that China's rise and transformation over the last few decades has been absolutely amazing. Napoleon had once remarked about China, and it's a quote that you'll read in many places, and Napoleon said, "Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." It seems China has reawakened, and it is making its presence being felt all around the world. As the Chinese people look back over 2,000 years, they are acutely aware that the past 30 years under its current leadership have been the best 30 years that the Chinese civilization has experienced since China was united by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. From the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century until the mid-20th century, Europe was to shape global history in a most profound manner. The engine of Europe's dynamism was industrialization and its mode of expansion, colonial conquest. Europe's position began to decline after the First World War and tumble down after Second World War. The fact that America, the new rising power, was a product of European civilization served as a source of respect and empathy and affinity between the old world order and the new world order, giving rise to ties which found expression in the idea of the West. For over 2 centuries, the West, first in the form of Europe and subsequently the United States, has dominated the world. However, when we look at the overall recorded history of the world, which goes back several thousand years, and we've pointed this out in several of our living history programs, Asia has been the most important region of the world. For nearly 2,000 years until the mid-1800s, China and India were the biggest economies of the world. In many ways, the last 200 years of European dominance have been an aberration. Human civilizations and nations are like living organisms. They have life cycles. Some evolve into new nations and cultures, and some totally disappear from the face of the globe. China represents a large nation and a civilization which has gone through several cycles and has had many ups and downs. China is the only ancient civilization to fall down several times and yet rise again to enter the modern world. One of the most important distinguishing features of China is that it is a civilizational state, unlike many other states in the world. For about 2,500 years, there has been a Chinese nation using a Chinese language. China has had a continuing experience of civilization, rivaled in duration perhaps only by Egypt, but then Egypt has been through a lot more ups and downs. One may ask, how do we know how Chinese civilization has developed? Well, it's thought that the earliest known written records of the history of China date from as early as 1250 BC, from the Shang dynasty, which we will go into in detail, and that lasted from about 1600 to 1046 BC, during the 21st Shang king's time. Ancient historical texts such as the Book of Documents, which was written around the 11th century BC, the Bamboo Annals written in 296 BC, and the records of the grand historian Sima Qian around 100 BC, mention and describe a Xia dynasty, which sort of lasted from 2070 BC to 1600 BC, before the Shang, but no writing is known from that period, and Shang writings do not indicate the existence of the Xia. The Shang ruled in the Yellow River Valley, which is commonly held to be the cradle of Chinese civilization. However, Neolithic civilizations originated at various cultural centers along both the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. Again, in some of our programs in the Middle East, we have shown why the river civilizations came to be and why those areas were important. Now, the Yellow River and the Yangtze civilizations arose a millennia before the Shang, with thousands of years of continuous history. China is one of the world's oldest civilizations and is regarded as one of the cradles of civilization. So with that introduction for this 4-part series, I'm going to ask Arif to kick off with really the earliest dynasty that we're aware of, the Jia dynasty. Please, Arif, if you could tell us a little bit.
Yes, so just to set the scene, the Jia dynasty of China is approximately between 2070 to 1600 BC, and it ruled China for about 400 years during that period. It's the first dynasty to be described in the ancient historical records of Sima Qian in the book Records of the Grand Historian and Bamboo Annals. The dynasty was considered mythical by historians until scientific excavations found early Bronze Age sites at Erlitou, Henan in 1959, which I believe is in northeast China. According to the ancient text, the Jia dynasty was founded by Yu the Great, who worked relentlessly for 13 years to control the flooding of the Yellow River, which continually and routinely destroyed the farmers' crops. After he had controlled the flooding, Yu established the hereditary system of succession and thereby the concept of dynasty, which has become most familiar. The ruling class and the elite lived in urban clusters, while the peasant population, who supported the elite's lifestyle, remained largely agrarian, living in rural areas. Yu's son, Qi, ruled after him, and power remained in the hands of the family until the last Jia ruler, Ji, was overthrown by Tang, and he established the Shang dynasty from 1600 to 1046 BCE, which also appears in recorded history and has been confirmed by archaeological findings.
So, Yusuf, perhaps then you could tell us a little bit about the Shang dynasty, because that's when really the historical records start telling us how China developed.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Iqbal. So the Shang ruled for around 600 years, from 1600 to 1046 BC, and it heralded the Bronze Age in China. The territory of the Shang dynasty contains today's Henan, Anhui, Shandong, Hubei, and Jiangxi provinces, with its central areas in Han and Hebei provinces. Tang was an important personage or ruler in the kingdom of Shang, who led a revolt against Ji and the Ji ruler and defeated his forces at the Battle of Mingtao around 1600 BCE. The extravagance of the Ji court and the resultant burden on the populace is thought to have led to the uprising.
The Chinese were lucky in that they had two great rivers which were so fertile, and the valleys were so fertile for civilization to develop. But again, the Shang really made the best use of that, Yusuf. Just take us through really the early developments of the Shang, so the Shang dynasty.
Yeah, certainly. So the Shang dynasty's power was concentrated in many Asian cities, some of which have been unearthed by archaeologists. The first Shang ruler supposedly founded a new capital for his dynasty at a town called Xiang near modern-day Zhengzhou, a city of 2.6 million. It's in the eastern China's Henan province, and the majesty of bronze was an important advancement for the Shang military. But the combination of horse, chariots, and composite bows were also integral to its success. The chariot, a two-wheeled war cart pulled by horses along Shang soldiers to move vast distances at great speeds, and also acted as a mobile archery platform. Shang archers also had composite bows made by combining animal sinew and horn or bone with wood. These materials gave a bow more power than a wooden bow of the same size. Archers were able to keep their bows small enough to shoot easily while standing in a chariot without losing power. The Shang religion was essentially polytheistic, characterized by a combination of animism, the idea that everything has a soul, shamanism, the belief in shamans who have the ability to communicate with the spiritual world, ancestor worship, and divination. Different gods represented natural and mythological symbols, such as the moon, the sun, the wind, the rain, the dragon, and the phoenix. Pheasants prayed to these gods for bountiful harvests. Festivals to celebrate gods were also common.
A series of 31 kings reigned over the Shang dynasty, and during their reign, according to the records of the grand historian Sima Qian, the capital was moved 6 times. The final most important move was to Yin in around 1300 BC, which led to the dynasty's golden age. And the first king, Tang, instantly began to work for the people of his country instead for his own pleasure and luxury, and provided the role model for his successors. These men created a stable government which would continue for 600 years, and that's a long time for any dynasty, as we've seen in some of our living history programs. Of course, they lost the mandate of heaven, and we're going to deal with that very important feature of Chinese civilization later on. But the Zhao dynasty then came to being, and I think, Arif, if you could take us through this, probably one of the most important dynasties really after the Shang dynasty in terms of the mythological and great civilizations.
Yes, of course. So the Zhao dynasty, which was in place from around 1046 to 256 BC, was started by King Wu. He was in the province of Zhao, and he rebelled against King Zhao of Shang and defeated his forces at the Battle of Mue, thereby establishing the Zhao dynasty. Wu rebelled against the ruling Shang after the king of Shang killed his older brother unjustly. The Zhao dynasty was among the most culturally significant, as you mentioned, Dr. Iqbal, of the early Chinese dynasties, and the longest lasting of any in China's history, ruling for around 800 years. It's divided into 2 periods: the Western Zhao, which was from 1046 to 771 BCE, and Eastern Zhao, which was from 771 to 256 BCE. The Zhao dynasty period also coincides with the ancient Greek civilization, both in terms of military innovation and might, as well as the rise of many great thinkers and philosophers.
I think this is really interesting because not only have these great sort of rulers, but also great thinkers, which also happened around the Western world, around Greece as well. So just coming to this term, mandate of heaven, it's interesting. It's such a central feature in Chinese civilization that the rulers and the dynasties only stayed until they had this mandate from heaven. So you can see the relationship with God and morality and doing good for the people. So the mandate of heaven was invoked by Wu and his family to legitimize the revolt, as he felt the Shang were no longer acting in the interest of people, and so had fitted the mandate between the monarchy and the god of law, order and justice, Shangti. During the battle, much of the Shang army defected and switched sides, showing the level of disenchantment with the Shang rule. So again, take us through this important transition, Arif.
So from the time of the Zhao dynasty onwards, the mandate of heaven became a key feature of Chinese civilization and the right of a dynasty to rule. As its name suggests, the mandate of heaven was thus defined as God's blessing on a just ruler and his right to rule. Now, of course, governments would use this to their advantage, but it was believed that when the government no longer served the will of the gods, that government would be overthrown. Further, it was stipulated that there could only be one legitimate ruler of China, and that his rule should be legitimized by his proper conduct as a steward of the lands entrusted to him by heaven. Rule could be passed from father to son, but only if the child possessed the necessary virtue to rule. This mandate, as I mentioned, would later be often manipulated by various rulers who were trying to entrust succession to an unworthy progeny.
The culture the Zhao established and maintained for almost, as you said, 800 years, which is a very long time for any dynasty, enabled the development of the arts, metallurgy, and some of the most famous names in Chinese philosophy, among them Confucius, Mencius, Mao Tzu, Lao Tzu, and Sun Tzu, all of whom lived and wrote during the period known as the time of the 100 schools of thought, during which individual philosophers established their own schools. The Zhao dynasty provided the foundation for the development of Chinese culture, and you will see these featured throughout the other dynasties that come later on, in particular the Han dynasty. Yusuf, just take us through, for example, some of the classics that were written and then the Western and the Eastern Zhao divisions.
Yeah, so the Chinese writing was codified and literature developed as evidence in the work known as Xing, the Book of Songs composed between the 11th and 7th centuries BCE. One of the 5 classics of Chinese literature, as you were mentioning, the poems of the Shijing would have been sung at the court and were thought to encourage virtuous behaviour and compassion for the members of all social classes. The Western Zhao period saw the rise of the decentralised state with a social hierarchy corresponding to European feudalism, in which land was owned by a noble, honoured bound to the king who had granted it, and was worked by the peasants. Western Zhao fell just before the era known as the Spring and Autumn period, and that sort of was coincided between 772 and 46 BCE. We then sort of move into the Eastern Zhao, the capital of Luoyang, and continued the Western Zhao model, but with an ever-increasing breakdown of imperial Chinese government, which resulted in the claim that Zhao had lost the mandate of heaven, as was articulated by Arif. That was a key cornerstone. The weakness of the king's position gave rise to the chaotic era known as the Warring States period, and that's quite an interesting period from 481 to 221 BCE, during which the 7 separate states of China fought each other for supremacy. The 7 states were Shu, Han, Qi, Qin, Wei, Yan, and Zhao, all of whom considered themselves sovereign, but none of whom felt confident in claiming that mandate of heaven, still held by the Zhao of Luoyang. All 7 of the states used the same tactics and observed the same rules of conduct in a battle, and so no one could gain the advantage over the others. This period ended with the victory of the state of Jin over others and establishment of the Xin dynasty, which tried to erase the accomplishments of Zhao in order to establish its own primary.
So the period of the Zhao dynasty was important because it produced some of the greatest thinkers in Chinese philosophy. For example, Confucius, which is 551 to 479 BCE, he believed that the violence of his day could be cured if everyone knew their place in the social hierarchy and respected one another. And Confucius's really writings have influenced China even up to the current time. And then there was, of course, Lao Tzu, sort of 6th to the 4th century, a little bit of uncertainty exactly when he was around, but he developed Taoism, or Taoism as sometimes it's called, which stressed freedom and being at one with nature without putting up any resistance. And then there was Sun Tzu, the famous military commander from 544 to 496 BCE, and he wrote the highly acclaimed The Art of War, which has been used by so many different army experts throughout the world, and still currently influences military thinking throughout the world. So, Arif, just tell us a little bit more about the impact of Confucius.
As you mentioned, Dr. Iqbal, Confucius is believed to have lived from 551 to 479 BCE, which was during the Eastern Zhao period. And he lived in the state of Lu, which is now Shandong or Shantung. After Confucius' death, his followers compiled his teachings into the Analects, which lay out Confucius' ethical system. The earliest written record of him dates from some 400 years after his death in the historical records of Shimakian. It was whilst he was teaching in his school that Confucius started to write. 2 collections of poetry were written. These were the Book of Odes and the Book of Documents. The Spring and Autumn Annals, which told the history of Lu, and the Book of Changes, was also a collection of treatises on divination. Unfortunately for posterity, none of these works outline Confucius' philosophy. So therefore, Confucianism had to be created from second-hand accounts, and the most reliable documentation of the ideas of Confucius is considered to be the Analects, even though here there is no absolute evidence that these sayings and short stories were actually said by him, and they often lack context or clarity and leave many of his teachings open to individual interpretation. There are three other major sources of Confucian thought. These are the Mencius, the Great Learning, and Mean. With the Analects, these works constitute the four books of Confucianism, otherwise referred to as the Confucian classics. Through these texts, Confucianism has become the official state religion of China from the 2nd century BCE.
History is such an important part of Confucian beliefs. For Confucius, the key to an ideal society was in the past. Confucius was an educated man born to a wealthy family, but he was very troubled by the political turmoil he observed. Confucius lived during the Eastern Zhao dynasty when different states were fighting to gain more power. It was an unstable time with frequent wars. Motivated to ease these problems, he developed a sophisticated and moral framework. His teachings would, of course, make a huge impact on Chinese culture and government, as his philosophy traveled along trade networks to other societies in East Asia as well. I think we're going to leave Confucius there for a little while, but his impact was just enormous, Arif, wasn't it? Let's turn to a few other thinkers. Yusuf, the thoughts of Confucius were further developed and codified by his disciples and two important philosophers, which were Mencius and Shunzi. Just take us through the importance of these and what they stated.
Yeah, as you said, Dr. Iqbal, philosophy played a key cornerstone within China, and whilst both these disciples, in terms of both, believed that man's sense of morality and justice separated him from other animals, Mencius expounded that belief that human nature is essentially good, whilst Zunji, although not of an opposite position, was slightly more pessimistic about human nature, and he therefore stressed the importance of education and ritual to keep people on the right moral track. Confucianism therefore expounded the importance of the four virtues, which we all possess. That was benevolence, they call it zhen, righteousness, yi, observance of rights, li, and moral wisdom, ti. A fifth was later added, faith, which neatly corresponded to the five elements. And in Chinese thoughts, they are earth, wood, fire, metal, and water. Once again, the belief that there is a close link between the physical and moral spheres is illustrated by stating that all men have such virtues. Two ideas are consequent. Education must nurture and cultivate them. All men are equal. With suitable application, anyone can become a sage. It is not innate talent which is important, but one's will mould one's character into the most virtuous possible.
Both Confucianism and Taoism focused on the goodness of people and their ability to improve themselves. But there was another ideology that was gaining much attention, and that was legalism. Legalism in ancient China was an important philosophical challenger and believed that human beings are more inclined to do wrong than right because they are motivated entirely by self-interest and require strict laws to control their impulses. It was developed by the philosopher Han Fei, was around 280 to 233 BCE, of this important state of Qin, who is said to have been a student of the Confucian reformer Shunzi, who departed from the central precept of Confucianism that humans were basically good, claiming they most certainly were not, for if they were, they would not need instruction in goodness. So Arif, just tell us a little bit more on Han Fei, and then probably a good time to have a break, I think. Go on.
Yes, so Han Fei drew on this one aspect of Shunxi's work, as well as the earlier writings of the Warring State period of China, which was from 481 to 221 BC, by a keen statesman named Shang Jiang, to develop his philosophy that since humans were inclined towards evil, laws were needed to control and punish them so that they could be social order. According to Shang, the law was the basis of power and it was to be applied equally to all. Therefore, peasants and noblemen should suffer the same severe punishments. For Shang, the ruler was the absolute power. So he is credited with the tactics of total war or the use of overwhelming force, which allowed the state of Qin to defeat the other warring states to control China.
Now, listeners, I'm sure will go on to the social media as I do, and there's lots of dramas about these ancient dynasty, and it's fascinating. China has produced quite a lot with English translations, but reading, obviously, the books in detail is a lot better, but it just shows you how much has been written about the ancient, perhaps mythological as well in some ways, civilizations. This, of course, leads us to probably the most important imperial dynasty that set and united China, and that was the Qin dynasty, but we're going to talk about that in part 2. This is probably a good place to stop. So just wanted listeners to please try to send your feedback on our programs at our hashtag, which is at VI Living History. We'd love to hear from you what you think of this program and all the other programs. If you go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and under the programs you will see all the Living History programs on the SoundCloud. And we have basically, done 34 programs so far on a whole variety, from early ideas of how the universe came into being, how human beings came into, how language developed, how early civilizations developed. We covered a 4-part series in the Middle East as well, big sections on Islamic civilization as well. And now, of course, this is one of the most important areas, the Chinese civilizations. We'll be doing a lot more. So please do visit it. We'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to part 2 of this series dealing with ancient China. So we'd covered the period up to really the Zhao dynasty and the warring states period. And now we come to really the Grand Master who unified China and to produce the first imperial dynasty, the Qin dynasty, which was from 221 to 206 BC, a crucial period for China. The Qin dynasty was the first, as I say, imperial dynasty that came to unify China. Named for its heartland in Qin state, the dynasty was founded by Yingjiang, the first emperor of Qin, who gave himself the official title of Qin Shi Huang, the significance of which we will explain later on. The Qin only ruled for 15 years, but despite its short reign, the dynasty greatly influenced the future of China, and in particular the shaping of policy and success of the Han dynasty that followed it. So really, China is grateful, and I think a lot of the movies and programs you see show that. So Yusuf, just take us through the formation of unified China under this dynasty.
Yeah, in 246 BC, during the Warring States, a period of weak Qin state crowned their new king. It was a 13-year-old Yingjiang from 259 to 210 BC. At such a young and sort of a prolific age, few believed that Yingjiang would be able to save himself from the intrigues of the palace, let alone become a successful Qin king. His father, the Prince Shiran, had ascended the throne 3 years earlier, but died unexpectedly, and so he had asked his wife, Lady Zhao, and his close friend and Prime Minister Li Buwei to mentor the young king and look after the state affairs until the king reached such an age of maturity and was ready to be fully crowned. The young king was a quick learner, soon showed that he could look after himself and his throne. By 238 BC, he had reached the mature age of 22 years, and as a remarkable show of his power and capability, he successfully put down a coup orchestrated by his mother and her lover, Lei, thus sending a clear message that he was in total control of his court and his kingdom.
Yes, Yingjiang was ambitious indeed, and he was a visionary and soon started to gather some of the most talented people in his state and from other states to fulfill his vision and his mission. He hired and promoted the best people he could find based on merit, no matter what their background. He set out to make the Qin state the dominant state and to bring all the states under his control, thus ending the period of endless wars. So Arif, just take us through how he managed to achieve that, because he had some good helpers.
Absolutely. As you said, he had a very strong vision, and to achieve this, he needed a strong economy and a large, well-armed military. So one of his first and most important appointments that he made was that of Li Si, who belonged to the Zhou state, but who was known to have a superb legal mind. So Li Si became the most important policymaker and advisor to the young king. Another foreigner, Zheng Gao, who was a superb hydraulic engineer from the Han state, he was hired for a prominent canal project that would make Qin the most fertile and prosperous state. The canal project was a great success, and it totally transformed the Qin lands, giving them great harvests. This led to a rapid growing economy, and so Yingzheng now had enough wealth accumulated to develop, train, and retain one of the largest and best trained and best equipped armies. Some people put the size of the army at over 1 million soldiers. By the time he was 29, Yingzheng felt he was now ready to make his vision a reality. So he adopted Shangyang's total war philosophy combined with the legalistic philosophy of Han Feizai and Li Si, and embarked on a ruthless military campaign. Over a 10-year period, one by one, he defeated all the other states, and he established himself as the first Chinese emperor. Having achieved his vision of unifying all the warring states, the title of Wang, meaning king, was changed by Yingzheng to Heng Dui, making his name Qin Shi Haodi, meaning August Emperor.
So Qin Shi Huangdi, basically, the August Emperor. So this is how the name was derived, and these emperor names carried on. As I mentioned earlier, Arif, legalism came to play a central role in Qin philosophy and Qin strategy as well. The other ideologies were really sidelined because they were felt to threaten the state in some ways, and there's a lot of controversy about that. Now, by 206 BC, the boundaries of the Qin Empire contained much of what we now regard as the heartland of modern China, stretching towards Vietnam in the south and as far as the Great Wall in the north, including the densely populated region between the Yangtze and the Yellow River. Dynasties that followed continued the expansion of China, and the huge size that China finally acquired was related to the natural borders of its continental landmass, bounded by the steppe in the north, the coastline to the south and east, and the mountains in the southwest. Of course, a lot of blood was shed, but compared to the 400 years of bloodletting, this was something that was worthwhile, in his view, to unite China, and historians will continue to write about his achievement. So, Yusuf, just tell us a little bit more about his achievement.
The Qin sought to create a unified but structured, centralized political power and a large military supported by a stable economy. The central government moved to an undercut aristocrats and landowners to gain direct administrative control over the peasantry, who comprised the overwhelming majority of the population and labour force. Shi Huangdi ordered the destruction of the walled fortifications which had separated the different states, and commissioned the building of a great wall along the northern border of his kingdom. Though little remains today of Shi Huangdi's original wall, but the Great Wall of China was begun under his rule, and we know the marvellous thing around that in terms of the Great Wall. Shi Huangdi also strengthened the infrastructure through road buildings, which helped to increase trade through the ease of travel. Shi Huangdi also expanded the boundaries of his empire, built the Grand Canal in the south, redistributed the land, and initially was a fair and just ruler. While he made great strides in building projects and military campaigns, his rule...
I think this is where, you see that somebody who starts off with a great vision but eventually gets lost, and, historians write that towards the end of his time, he became power-possessed, seeking immortality and finding sort of different elixirs that would give him immortality. And unfortunately, poisoning led to his own death with mercury poisoning, because in those days they thought these metals achieved some. He died in 210 with an incredible legacy, and it left his eldest son as the heir. But of course, Li Si and the eunuchs and other power builders intervened to make the more pliable son the emperor, and that's why the rule only lasted 15 odd years. Arif, just tell us a little bit about his legacy, because China discovered something amazing about his mausoleum, didn't they?
Yes, I think so. I think a lot of our listeners will have come across this. So his desire to provide for himself an afterlife commensurate with his present one led him to commission a palace built for his tomb and an army of over 8,000 terracotta warriors created to serve him in eternity. This ceramic army, buried with him, also included terracotta chariots, cavalry, a commander-in-chief, and assorted birds and animals. And I'm sure, as I said, many of our listeners will have seen that, because that's been discovered, I think, fairly recently.
Yeah, I think so. The time period was short for the dynasty, 15 years, but what they set in motion was something incredible, and the dynasty that followed was a truly incredible dynasty, and that's the Han dynasty, which ruled from 206 to 220 BC, and it's actually the longest imperial dynasty that ruled China. After the Qin dynasty, of course, declined, the Chu and the Han states fought for control of the country until Jiang Ju of Chu was defeated by Liu Bang of the Han at the Battle of Gyaxia in 202 BCE, and the Han dynasty was founded. The Han dynasty lasted for 400 years, which is a pretty long period, considering the Shang was 600, the Zhao 800, and now we had 400 years for a big imperial dynasty. So, longest lasting imperial dynasty. Interrupted with a few breaks, but overall, between the Eastern Han and the Western Han, they managed to have quite good. And it's regarded as the first golden age of Chinese civilization. So, Arif, just take us through some of the achievements and formation of the Han dynasty, please.
So first of all, the Han dynasty derives its name from the Han River, which is a tributary of the Yangtze River in central China. Liu Bang, he was actually a peasant in the declining Qin Empire, and he led an army that captured Shenyang, the Qin capital city, in 206 BC, and together with Yang Yu of the Zhao, he ended the Qin Empire. Liu Bang then conquered territories and defeated rival armies to emerge as the emperor of the Han Empire in 202 BC, and his official title was Emperor Zhao of Han. The Han rulers, beginning with Emperor Zhao, figured out how to mix the harsh but effective legalism of the Qin dynasty with the softer ideology of Confucianism and Taoist ideas. So obedience was still demanded, but the blended philosophy also recognized that the rulers and the state had an obligation to provide for their people. As mentioned before, the mandate of heaven philosophy was still around and was still supported by a government led by Confucian scholars who were literate and effective. They put in place systems to communicate with each other, to collect data, and to report on problems. The result was a period of peaceful conditions and relative wealth. Peasants could work the land, producing more food, trade with the state expanded, and the millet-growing regions of the north and the rice-growing regions of the south could send food to each other. This was very important if one crop or other failed. Han emperors, in many cases, they expanded the state, and there is evidence that some people outside of central China welcomed their rule. Populations exploded as a result of this stability and reliable food production. So the new Emperor Zhao treated all of his former adversaries with respect and united the land under his rule. He made peace with the other states which had risen in rebellion against the falling Qin dynasty, and the resultant peace initiated by Zhao brought the stability necessary for culture to again thrive and grow. Trade with the West had now begun during this time, and the arts and technology increased in sophistication.
Gaozu was clearly a visionary emperor who managed to really bring his people together, and that's why the dynasty lasted for 400 years. The Han are considered the first dynasty to write their history down, and as we mentioned earlier on, it was during this period that Sima Qin started writing the history of China down, as the grand historian is referred to. But Shi Hangdui destroyed so many of the written records of those who came before him. Sometimes this claim of the first historian is disputed. There is also a view that as historian like Sima Qian wrote history during the Han period, previous rulers like Qin Shi Huangdi and others may have been somewhat tarnished unfairly to make the Han achievements look glorious. There is no doubt, however, that the great advances were made under the Han in every area of the culture. So after the death of Emperor Gaozu in 195 BC, the Crown Prince Liu Ying succeeded him and continued his policies. These programs maintained stability and a culture enabling the greatest of the Han emperors, Wu, also known as Wu the Great, from 141 to 87 BC, to embark on his enterprises of expansion, public works, and cultural initiatives. He was truly one of the great emperors of China. So, Yusuf, if you could just take us through his period.
Yeah, so Wu was considered the seventh emperor of the Han dynasty, and his reign of 54 years was one of the longest in Chinese history. His personal name was Li Shu, linking him all the way back to the founder of the Han dynasty, Lu Bang. However, this ceremonial name was Wu Di, and the character Di in Chinese is simply meant emperor, and the character Wu meant martial or warlike. Thus, he is sometimes referred as Wu Di, and sometimes as Emperor Wu. Emperor Wu is considered one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history due to his effective governance, which made him the Han dynasty one of the most powerful nations in the world. Despite establishing an autocratic and centralized state, Emperor Wu adopted the principles of Confucianism as a state philosophy and the code of ethics for his empire, and started a school to teach future administrators of the Confucian classics. These reforms had an enduring effect throughout the existence of imperial China and an enormous influence on neighboring civilizations. As a military campaigner, Emperor Wu led Han China through its greatest expansion. At his heights, the emperor's borders spanned from the Fergana Valley in the west to Korea in the east and northern Vietnam in the south. Along with the diplomatic efforts made by Zhang Jin, and the sphere of influence of the Han Empire extended to the states in the Tarim Basin, opened up the Silk Road that connected China to the west, stimulating bilateral trade and cultural exchange. To the south, various small kingdoms far beyond the Yangtze River Valley were formally incorporated into the empire. At the same time, Han armies also defeated armies and navies to the south, and the empire expanded into what now northern Vietnam, Yunnan, Gongji, and Guangdong. In this way, by the 100 BC, the size of the Han Empire was more than double what it was at the beginning.
The previous emperors of the Han dynasty were hard-pressed by the Xiongnu. These were the warlike northern sort of nomadic people. And the founder of the Han dynasty, Emperor Gaozu, had a disastrous battle with the Xiongnu and nearly lost himself and his empire. So he therefore resorted to marriage alliances to keep them at bay. But of course, Wu Di was not going to have any of this. And Arif, just take us how he managed to sort out the Xiongnu during his reign.
So during his reign, the Han, under two impressive generals, they started winning major battles against the Yongju. A series of defeats under the command of General Wei Qing, the half-brother of Emperor Wu's favorite concubine and Wei's nephew, Ha Qubing, led to the expulsion of the Yangzhou from the Ordos Desert and the Kilin Mountains in the Mongolian Plateau. As a result of these territorial acquisitions, the Han dynasty successfully opened up the northern Silk Road, allowing direct access to trade with Central Asia. This also provided a new supply of high-quality horse breeds from Central Asia, including the famed Fergana horse, and this further strengthened the Han army. Emperor Wu then reinforced this strategic asset by establishing 5 commanderies and constructing a length of fortified wall along the border of the Hexa corridor, colonizing the area with 700,000 soldier settlers.
The Emperor Wu, after him, the empire slipped into gradual stagnation and decline, and in 9 AD, a usurper sort of claimed the mandate of heaven, but that didn't last very long. The Han dynasty was quickly restored, and Emperor Guangwu, with the support of landholding and merchant families at Luoyang, east of the former capital Xi'an. Thus, the new era is termed the Eastern Han Dynasty, with the capable administrations of Emperors Ming and Zhang. Former glories of the dynasty was reclaimed with brilliant military and cultural achievements. The Xiongnu Empire was decisively defeated during this period, and the Silk Road became a major feature of the Han Dynasty, and the arrival of Buddhism, etc., again played an important part. And of course, contacts were made with the Roman Empire, and Roman emissaries came to China to exchange gifts, etc., as well. The Eastern Han Dynasty was one of the most prolific era of science and technology in ancient China, notably the historic invention of paper making by Tai Lan, and the numerous scientific mathematical contribution by the famous polymath as well. So just take us through this final period, Yusuf, under the Emperor Zhang.
Yeah, so under Emperor Zhang from 75 to 88 CE, China was so prosperous that it was partners in trade with all major nations of the day, and continued in this way after his death. The Han Empire was contemporaneous with the Roman Empire, and they were about equal in size and population. According to a census conducted in 2 AD, there were about 57,700,000 people in the Han Empire, and there were about 55 million in the Roman Empire in 14 AD. At their greatest extent, the Han Empire in 100 AD measured about 6.5 million kilometers, and and the Roman Empire in its greatest extent measured about 5 million kilometers. So the Romans under Marcus Aurelius in 166 CE considered China's silk more precious than gold and paid China whatever price was asked.
So you can see the greatness of the Han dynasty and the Han Empire, but of course it came to an end partially due to conflict and intrigue within the royal court, and also natural disasters and rebellions as well. So when the Han dynasty fell into decline, it fractured into 3 kingdoms period, which was between 220 to 265 AD, and really the Han name survived, but real control went to major commanders and generals like Cao Cao. So the end of the dynasty saw the great Battle of Red Cliffs, in which really massive armies clashed. It's recorded that between 270,000 and 850,000 personnel participated in this major battle, which was very destructive, but really it spelled the end of the Han dynasty, and then we got to the warring period. We had, Arif, another period, the northern and southern dynasties. Just very briefly before we go on to the Sui dynasty, just take us through that period very quickly.
Yes, so this was in the early 5th century. China entered a period known as the northern and southern dynasties, in which there were parallel regimes ruling the northern and southern halves of the country. In the south, the eastern Jin gave way to the Liu-Song, southern Qi, Liang, and finally Chen. And each of these southern dynasties were led by Han Chinese ruling families and used Jiankang, modern Nanjing, as the capital. They held off attacks from the north and preserved many aspects of Chinese civilization, while the northern barbarian regimes began to Sinify. During this messy time, many religions emerged, and Buddhism was popular among the barbarian kingdoms in North China.
This was, of course, a really messy time, 400 years of, again, conflict and disunity. But China was once again reunified under the Sui dynasty. So, Yusuf, if you could quickly take us through the Sui dynasty period?
Yeah, so the Sui dynasty lasted only for 37 years with two reigning emperors, but it managed to reunify, as you said, China, and it short-lived in comparable to the Qin dynasty before China prepared for its second gold age under the Tang dynasty. Sui dynasty was founded by Emperor Wen, whose original name was Yang Jing. He was an ethnic Han serving under the ruling northern Zhao dynasty and had been given the title of Su, which means to follow, a title which is used for its own dynasty. After having usurped the northern Zhao throne in 581, Wen set out to conquer the southern Shen dynasty in 588. The Su had amassed 518,000 troops along the northern bank of the Yangtze River, stretching from Sichuan to the East China Sea. The Chen dynasty could not withstand such an assault, and in 589, Su troops enter Jingkang, and the last emperor of Shen surrendered. The city was razed to the ground while Su troops escorted Shen nobles back north, where the northern aristocrats became fascinated with everything that the south had to provide culturally and intellectually.
The Sui pioneered many new institutions, including the government system of the 3 departments and 6 ministries, imperial examinations for selecting officials from commoners, conscription of militia to increase the army during emergencies, and redistribution of land to peasants. These policies, which were adopted by later dynasties, brought enormous population growth and amassed excessive wealth to the state. Standardized coinage was enforced throughout the unified empire. Buddhism took root in the region. So in the short period, they achieved quite a bit. The Grand Canal and the Great Wall, Arif, were important contributions. Just quickly take us through that.
Yes, so the Grand Canal, basically this was linking the capitals of Daxing and Luoyang to the wealthy southeast region, and another route to the northeast border. The Great Wall was expanded, and a series of military conquests and diplomatic manoeuvres further pacified its borders. Also during this time, literature flourished, and it's thought that the famous legend of Hugh Mulan about a young girl who takes her father's place in the army was composed, or at least it was set down during this time.
The Sui, again, made major improvements, as I said, to the Great Wall. They had major battles with the Eastern Turks, who had replaced the Shon Yu in the north, the nomadic tribes. So they were continuously in battle, and of course they had disastrous campaigns in Korea, and they lost a lot of wealth, and that really led to them losing the mandate of heaven and wrecking the economy of China and sort of coming to an end. So there's a lot more one could say about the Sui dynasty, but it was short-lasted. So I think it's probably a good time to just summarize in this first part. The Yangtze and the Yellow River provided the fertile environment for early Chinese civilizations to develop around 2500 BC. By 1600 BC, China had entered the Bronze Age with the Shang dynasty. However, it was the Zhao dynasty which ruled for nearly 800 years, which is amongst the most culturally significant of the early Chinese dynasties. Their rule was the longest lasting in Chinese history, and during this there were great teachers like Confucius and many others that came to bring so much richness to China. The process of China coming together as a nation under a highly centralized state headed by a single monarch was achieved in 221 by the Qin Emperor Shi Hongdai, and his great achievements have been noted. And then, of course, China had the greatest dynasty, the Han dynasty, followed by the achievements of the Sui dynasty. So, hope listeners found this useful. Again, please do send us your feedback at our hashtag Voice of Islam Living History, and we'd love to hear from you. Next program, we're going to carry on with part 2 of the Chinese dynasties. Assalamu alaikum. Goodbye.